You want severance theories? You want severance feedback? Well, guess what? You're in the right place because we know severance. That's right. It's WeKnowSeverance.com here on RHAP. We know scripted TV, and we know that you've all been huffing and puffing and waiting. Oh, gosh, phrasing for this episode of the Severance podcast, talking about some of that sweet vitriol. I'm Josh Wigler. I am joined once again by Dr. Amanda, who helped exercise some sweet vitriol with me on the recap this week.
Yes, we got together and talked about this episode already, Josh, but I am thrilled that Melissa has finally answered my calls. She's been sending me to voicemail.
It was a lot. We were just calling Melissa all day, and finally she picked up and said, "Don't tell me anything. I haven't watched the episode yet."
Yeah, I've been just at the dentist because I've been wearing away my gums with the heavy-handed brushing that I've been doing.
Yes, okay. Well, let's start with the most important stuff. Break down Harmony Cobel's toothbrushing technique for us.
Oh, I mean, and this is someone who every single time I go to the dentist is like, "You're brushing too hard. Your gums are receding. You need." And I was like, "I am a straight A student. I do things to the best of my as vigorously as possible. I put my whole energy into it, and that is not what you want to be doing with toothbrushing." So
you want to like
toothbrush. We're working on it, but you
want to like half hand it as a toothbrusher. Like you want to go 50% of where you think you're supposed to go. A delicate touch, Dr. Amanda. That's what we want to give to the dentist.
Wow. I mean, dentists are, pretty dubious here in this series we know so far. But the thing that struck me most about the Harmony Cobel toothbrushing sequence was how flippantly she litters, throwing her plastic water bottle willy-nilly.
Yeah.
If Salt's Neck ain't what it once was, Harmony, you're certainly not contributing to its revival by being a litter bug.
Do we think that that's just like a testament to her feelings on the town, or is it just like, what's one more water bottle going to do to this place?
To the woman who invented a technology that is torturing untold numbers of people, what is a little bit of litter?
Yeah, your outie is a litter bug. I would hate to hear that. That would make me so upset. Heartbreaking. We've got so much feedback here for a controversial episode of Severance, a divisive episode of Severance. You all wrote in severancerhap@gmail.com. Keep writing in with 2 episodes left of Severance, and make sure you're subscribed so you do not miss our recaps, our feedback and theory shows, all the good stuff. But today, our opening line of inquiry, actually, we've got feedback that we'd like to get from Dr. Melissa, because you were not on the recap with us. So Amanda and I have no idea what you thought of this episode and are eager to get your thoughts. So what did you think?
I mean, so first of all, let's, put the elephant out of its misery at the very start. This episode was filmed in Canada. This is in Newfoundland. I was so excited.
So automatically the best episode of Severance.
The best episode of Severance to ever have happened. Yeah.
There's so many people who I've talked to who are like, well, it was a beautiful episode. Like as sort of like, they're like, well, there was that. And
it wasn't Canada's fault.
When I started reading about it, I was like, oh man, we would have really gone long on the aesthetics with our Canadian correspondent on the recap show.
Yeah, I have been trying to get to Newfoundland for years. My family did a whole cross-Canada trip, and it was the one province that we didn't get to. I recently went back to the Maritimes and was ready to drive around. We drove around all the rest of Atlantic Canada, and then we were going to go up to Newfoundland, and it was going to cost us $700 just to take the ferry there and back.
Wow.
Because the short way is 16 hours.
No.
You could basically you take a ferry to one side, drive across, take the ferry back, and it's going to take you an entire day just to take the ferry on each side. It's so far north, and it's so uncomprehensible. You look at a map and you're like, yeah, it's just right there. It's not. It's so far away.
With all due respect to to the great Canada. I can't do that. That's a lot. That's a lot of travel. That's a lot of travel. That's a lot of money for a ferry ride.
Yeah. So next time I'm just going to fly straight into Gander because
I think that's it.
That seems like the move. I mean, I listened to the official Severance podcast with Ben Stiller and Adam Scott, and
officially friends of the pods, as we all know.
Officially friends of the pod.
Yep.
And I think I'm not going to get this. I might not be totally accurate, but they spent something like 2 weeks up in Newfoundland filming this episode. This like was a tremendous undertaking, and talk about like location scouting and the thoughtfulness about what is something that would seem far away but drivable from the kind of upstate New York looking landscape that we're used to, where Keir is set. So they definitely did their work scouting just the right location and depicting it in all of its visual glory. Beautiful episode, beautiful landscape. Melissa, were there any non-Canada takes that you have about this episode?
Before we move on, I do just want to say that we did get a email from from a listener named Douglas, who wrote in and said, "Everyone but you guys know it was filmed in Newfoundland. There was a picture of Keir and his woman stirring a huge bowl of ether, and you guys didn't know." I'm going to listen to people that know, because you don't. Wow, we got burned bad by Douglas.
Okay. I was going to say Douglas, like Tommy Douglas, famous Canadian inventor of Canadian healthcare. No, different Douglas.
Different Douglas. An
different
impolite Douglas.
Well, I mean, it's okay. I didn't know until I listened to Ben and Adam talk about it. I just suspected because it looked like Canada. But lots of things look like Canada and aren't Canada, although usually it is. Usually if it looks like I can pick up the West Coast out of anywhere. Usually I'm looking and I'm like, that's
it looks like a Canadian goose, if it clucks like a Canadian goose.
Yeah, that's not San Francisco. That's Vancouver. That's not Seattle. That's Vancouver. That's not Portland. That's Vancouver. Yeah. So I will. Okay. I have my other like total tangent side note from listening to you both on the recap pod that has nothing really to do with this episode, but I did need to talk about the bearded vulture.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I have fun vulture facts that I wanted to share on the podcast.
Sure. Yes, please. I'll try to appreciate all of them equally.
Yeah. Lots of people know I am a big lover of animal facts of any kind. If you have a strange animal fact, please send it my way. I enjoy collecting them very much. But so vulture, I went to a like bird of prey thing on Vancouver Island, and we got to learn about vultures, among other things. Vultures are very, very cool. So their stomach, the pH in their stomach is basically equivalent to battery acid. And so
it's not basically.
It's not basic. It's very acidic. Yes. Okay. But so when they eat dead things that have maybe died of like rabies, for example, they destroy the rabies virus and therefore like remove it from the environment, as opposed to like if a dog comes along and eats it, that the dog just like gets and that rabies like stays within the ecology. And so in areas where the vulture population has been reduced and is like endangered, instances of human rabies are higher because that rabies virus isn't being removed from the environment. And then like that dog could go on and like bite a kid or whatever, right? And so we get like human rabies. And so they're playing this like super important job in our ecosystem, which I think is very cool. And the other thing, their legs are white because they essentially bleach themselves by peeing on themselves because they're standing in, dead things all the time. And so they just like pee out this like very kind of acidic urea. And so they like kill off any like germs on their body by just like peeing on themselves. Anyway, so those are my fun vulture facts.
Sounds like, maybe not a terrible idea to keep yourself like really super clean.
Yeah. Anyway,
so just hang out with the bearded vulture.
Yeah. I'm gonna take some time to look into all of that.
Anyway, all right. Well, I actually really enjoyed the episode. I know that people
I was going to ask, are you like Amanda and I peeing down the leg of the bearded vulture known as sweet vitriol, or are you here to remove the rabies from the environment? Because there has been a lot of hate for this episode. I've seen it both ways. We've had feedback in both directions. We had one from Jarrett that was called Worst Episode Ever. Yawn
No.
was the review from Jarrett, and said was very disappointed after waiting a full week to get episode 8. There were other people. Al Chalant wrote in to say to contest our review, Amanda, and say if they'd made Cobel's story stretch for all of season 2, we'd be so upset, saying that they'd Harrenhaled her like Matt Smith on season 2 of House of the Dragon, or Rebecca Ferguson on season 2 of Silo, which Amanda, you have you'll have to catch up on.
Yes.
Alchalant says they did the right thing by leaving her behind until it was time for her to re-enter the story. Good storytelling. So we have it both ways. And so I'm glad now the podcast does as well. Melissa, tell us what you like.
Yeah. So first of all, I think that part of the idea that like a Severance episode is a bit of the innies, a bit of the outies, we move the story forward. It's just not the case for season 2, right?
Yeah.
The majority of the episodes this season have not been that in some way or the other. We've had our full innie episode, our full outie episode, the Ortbo last episode, and then this one, right? And so and last episode to some extent was like a bit of outie, a bit of innie, but it was like a total Gemma story. And this is just the total Cobel story. And I think that I would have been fine with the idea of this sort of being sprinkled through the last few episodes, but I think that part of it was this chance to just like spend this extended period of time in this town and understand the devastation that Lumon has left in its wake, right? And to really sort of sit with that. And I thought that that was very interesting. And for me, the main part of this episode that I thought was so cool was this expansion of the world building, all of the information that we got in terms of the fact that like Lumon was in this town, there was an ether mill here, child labor was involved, Cobel worked there. In obviously like, and in addition to the whole like inventing of the Severance, but her mom was like not a fan, but her aunt was this devotee. And so I think that we learned so much in this episode that I was a bit surprised by the reaction, because I thought there was just like so much that similar to last episode where it was like a different take, but still providing so much information for that about like kind of the bigger world of Lumon beyond just like the life of our 4 main innies and outies. So while I certainly am looking forward to getting back to them again, like I'm sure we are about to get that. Like I don't think that next episode is going to be like, now let's follow Ragabi for 40 minutes, right? Like I don't think that that's
Oh gosh, can you imagine? Could you
So like I think that the next 2 episodes are going to be some important fallout from this episode, but also from all of the episodes that we've had leading up. And so sure, maybe that there was a different way to do it, but I didn't mind this choice because I thought that it was a very interesting opportunity for us to just like dive deep into what has Cobel been up to this whole time and what happened. Yeah, driving, just a lot of driving. Newfoundland is really far away. Also probably a ferry. Like
probably a ferry ride as well.
Yeah, it's really, really far. But I don't know. I was a bit surprised by the negative response to this episode. I understand it for those who, like yourselves, this didn't quite hit for, and I think that that's totally fine. But it just wasn't at all how I felt, and I was a bit surprised while seeing it. I was just like very engrossed in the world building of this episode, and then even more excited to now get back to our main 4 and see how Cobel sort of crashes into them next episode.
On the world building tip, that was a recurring note from a lot of the feedback that we got as well from the people who liked this one. So Polysonic, a regular customer around these parts, had a couple of really interesting points of feedback. We'll get to the second one later, but this one, Polly said that she'd been an innie for 3 very long years, yearning to know what was out in the world beyond the severed floor. Was the rest of the world populating the sea? Was it our world or the future? What little we saw of Keir, Gans, and Dieter Forrest was mostly weird. Now we see a town far away from Lumon Branch 501 that is just like the one I grew up in, says Polysonic.
Wow.
Getting out and away from MDR is one of the biggest things that's happened for me, not to mention this new perspective on harmony. So I think a lot of people really do appreciate that we're getting to see what the world looks like hundreds of miles away from the main show. I would also submit one other thing that is very relieving for me about the fact that we got to this place hundreds of miles away is I have to imagine that this is going to shut down a lot of the people who think Severance is a simulation. None of this is real. It's all VR. It's like, no, we were with Harmony Cobel, unsevered character, inventor of Severance, as it turns out, driving hundreds of miles so far that it took her multiple episodes to get where she's going. That is a brick and mortar place. That is not a virtual reality. So I feel like
probably not going back, right? It's so far away. We're probably never going to be in Salt Neck ever again. So don't worry.
I can't imagine why we would go back. Totally agreed. So Dr. A, does any of this impact your opinion, or even has like the weekend changed anything for you? Repeat viewings?
I mean, I think that I agree with everything that Melissa said, and people are babies. I'm a baby included. And, you know, I want my snarky Devin moment. I want Dylan saying something funny. Like, I want John Turturro. Like, I want to see the characters that I love. And that's part of the reaction. And does that mean that this wasn't a successful artistic choice? Does it mean it wasn't right for the storytelling? Does it mean that this isn't a valuable installment of this great show? No, it means that like I'm having that reaction, which I think other viewers had as well. And I think that it's really good to point out the things that are successful about this. And like, this is in service of a story that we don't know the end of yet.
Yeah.
And this can end up being, when all is said and done, I mean, pretty big reveal about Cobel's role in terms of the inventor of Severance, recontextualizes a lot of the things we had already seen from Cobel in season 1 and season 2. So that is fascinating. And I'd be curious on the rewatch, like now knowing this, how we view this character. So those things are, you know, this is an important installment of this story, certainly. And there's lots of great things about this episode of television. I love Severance so much. I love every episode of Severance as much as I love lots of things, like my family notwithstanding. So,
I thought you were about to include your family in it. It's like, Amanda.
Some people outside of my
for
immediate
Severance.
family,
Yeah,
but like my immediate family, no, I love them more.
But some extended family members, for sure.
Some extended family are a little bit lower on the list than
I was going to say, some of my extended family are lower than Severance. Absolutely.
I mean, come on, like, you know, Defiant Jazz. It's like a pretty good episode. So I think that I'll still continue to say this is probably my least favorite episode of Severance. That's not saying it's bad or that like, oh my God, they effed this up and like we should have done something totally different. I can't wait to see the rest of this season play out. But you know, like I think if people are having a little bit of a hissy fit because it's hard to wait a whole week to see our favorites again. And like we want to see the plot advance. And when you're binging, this is probably going to go down real easy, but I totally understand where the fandom is coming from and the week to week.
So, of course, we have tons of feedback about Harmony Cobel specifically. I'm really excited to get your takes on the reveals about Harmony in this episode, Melissa. We had feedback from Claire, who gets us into this. Claire is one of the people who didn't love the episode. Claire said, "I've been thinking about what did and didn't work for me in episode 8. One gripe I have is with the lack of a narrative payoff for the Cobel invented Severance reveal. It's interesting that Amanda noticed Helena's comment back in Zufu about her father inventing the chip. Maybe I'm a less discerning viewer, but I didn't catch that. Hence, where reveals like Helena is an Egan or Gemma is alive downstairs had great impact for me because I'd been pondering those questions. The reveal here is really diminished because who invented the Severance chip isn't something I'd been wondering about at all, but I do stand a woman in STEM." That is the feedback from Claire. I think I'm trying to kind of go back in the mental Rolodex of the 3 years of Severance podcasting on and off that we have done. Melissa, have we ever asked who invented this? Has that been a question that we were even looking at, let alone what Cobel's involvement in that could have been?
Yeah, I don't think so, right? Because I think we've sort of been told from the beginning that it was James Egan or that it was part of this
It was
Lumon
Anne Egan,
invented
yeah.
thing. And then eventually we sort of get, James talking about bringing the first one home and Helena seeing it and everything. So, we sort of know that it was around that time that it was being developed. I think that it's interesting that this idea that the questions that we haven't even thought yet to ponder aren't as satisfying when they pay off than the ones we've been wondering about, because I think it's such a double-edged sword, right? Because the other thing is then we get the like Helena and Helly reveal, and the whole internet is like, well, obviously we already figured that one out. That's
Right.
not. So it's like it's tough, right? Because what do? They have to hint that there's something to speculate about, but not not actually let us figure out what the speculation should be. So it's a bit tough. I get that for some people that won't have paid off. I think for me, it was less of a like, I think I'm still very curious what this means, because I think the invention of severance, I'm sort of curious what Cobel's like thought process was around that, because right now it just feels like, oh, okay, so you're even worse of a person than we thought you were, right? Like you are
Right.
directly responsible for all of this suffering that has happened here. And even if there were the best of intentions, and part of it is like, okay, you were a child, theoretically part of this Wintertide Fellowship, um, whatever, and so we're taken advantage of by this like very powerful person, and your ideas stolen, and what woman hasn't been in a meeting and had their thing they said repeated by a dude, and everyone's like, oh, what a great idea you've had just there, right? So it's relatable at least.
Totally.
But it's interesting. I'm not really sure what this means about how we are supposed to feel about Cobel yet. And I think it's because it really matters what she does next with this
Yeah.
information. So I'm
Yeah.
intrigued, but I understand. Yeah, I think it's an interesting point about like, oh, well, we never even wondered about it. And so it does always make me think, because we've wondered about a lot of things on the show that
A
have
lot of
not
things.
been worth wondering
I
about. So.
I agree with noting that like who is the creator of Severance has never been one of the great mysteries of the show, whereas there are a lot of great mysteries. And for a reveal to pay off, it needs to have some relevance to something that was unsatisfying or you were questioning, or something that felt very relevant to the story. While I have not been wondering who is the creator of Severance, I have been wondering, Harmony Cobel, what is your game?
Yes.
And this
Yeah.
episode, the reveal was, I think, very successful in illuminating what is going on for Harmony, what her relationship has been to Lumon, why she's had the interest in Mark that she has, why she's had the interest in Severance, even going back to like how she knows how to remove a severance chip from Petey's head, not usually a middle management skill
Correct.
that is
Mhm.
being trained on, why she's seems to
I've been
be
in middle management jobs and they did not teach me how to do
they
that.
didn't teach you that.
No, me neither.
Like, why she's so looped into, oh, this must be Ragabi. Like, I feel like this is something that feels satisfying and feels like we built to this, just because there have been so many question marks around Cobel's motivation. And I think it's kind of cool that this is one of these mysteries that Reddit didn't pre-solve and that everybody's had to kind of mull over. So, whose grand design is Severance? Not a big question in my mind until this episode, but really understanding what Harmony Cobel's relationship is to all of this is something that has been a mystery, and I think that was a satisfying payoff.
So we have feedback on the sequence of events that had to have occurred for this to happen. We're hopefully going to find that out. If not soon, then definitely someday on this show. We'll get more history of how it was possible for Harmony to be the brilliant genius scientific mastermind behind the severance chip, only to end up running the severed floor. It does not seem like a job she was aiming for. Kyle posits a thought of how this could have worked out. Kyle thinks it could have worked out that she invents the chip. She shows it to James Egan because he's the religious leader. She feels like she can trust him. James steals the idea, credits himself, does not acknowledge that Harmony has any involvement whatsoever. And in order to appease Harmony and keep her from revealing the truth, he offers her a quote-unquote prestigious job, plucking her out of a deadbeat town to managing the floor where he knows she'll be more or less out of sight from anyone who might work out that he actually invented the chip. She feels loyalty to the religion and the company, so she's been inclined to keep quiet until now. Some version of that feels right to me. Maybe not entirely that version of it. Like, I feel like Harmony being closer to the center of the Lumon universe than just like being plucked from Salt Neck after like figuring this out. I feel like there's been more time spent within Lumon, but some version of that, and therefore like some version of a relationship between her and James Egan, some sort of existing dynamic that we have yet to really tap into. That I buy, and that I feel like we're going to be getting into at some point. If not soon, eventually.
Yeah, very much. And it makes me wonder about whether there wasn't some pretty big philosophical difference between Harmony and James that led to the, her getting sidelined. Like, if she, as the inventor of Severance, had a very different vision for how it would be used, or perhaps if she understood some of the limitations of Severance or something about the way that Severance functions that would have undermined whatever story it is that Lumon wants to sell. So, for example, she's very, very interested in whether reintegration is possible. She's very interested in how permeable the Severance barrier is. Now, all of a sudden, those concerns, I think, have a lot more credence now that we know that she's the person who invented the whole damn thing. And does having that information out there, or having somebody who knows too much, like, ultimately undermine whatever the story is about Severance that James Egan and his, political conspirators like want to sell? I think it's really interesting to imagine that timeline, like all of those steps that led to whatever break there was between Harmony and Lumon. So I think that all of that is really interesting to explore.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to think about this connection too of like, why would young Harmony have been motivated to develop this kind of technology, and to think about the town that she was living in and the witnessing of, this ether mill, and potentially, some people have that already starting to have a negative impact on the town, and seeing people choosing to sort of dissociate from their current lives using that. And was this viewed as like a, quote unquote, less harmful way of allowing them to do that? I'm not really interested at this point in just like writing it off and saying like, oh, Harmony was just trying to, help people with PTSD and it's totally like not a bad thing at all, right? Like, I don't actually think that that's the case. I think that there's I think that this was largely done in service of Keir, and that she was this sort of devoted individual. But I do sort of wonder what the environment was like around Harmony that led to this being the thing that she invented. Like, why was this the question that she was looking to solve, which I think is interesting.
Sherry has a theory, and also has a bit of a play on words theory that makes this kind of great. Sherry says, I wonder if Harmony's surname is a play on the name Nobel. According to lore, Alfred Nobel, the inventor of dynamite, was so worried that he'd be remembered as the inventor of something that killed people that he set up an endowment to honor those whose work benefits humanity. Harmony Cobel probably created Severance to benefit downtrodden workers, and then saw her invention being used for evil. So she's been working to make amends. That's why she's been keeping such close tabs on Mark. Sherry then says, that's my random thought, which followed my initial thought that this was a complete waste of 36 minutes and could have been done in 5 minutes as part of a regular episode.
Wow.
So, we give and we take with the feedback.
We give and we take. I mean, I do think it adds like a very fascinating layer to Harmony's character and to the story of the origin of Severance, that we know that the inventor grew up doing hard child labor in a very like toxic environment, that she like has been traumatized by work, right? That the origin of this very idea comes from somebody who has the experiences, not just of Dan Erickson being bored at a door factory, but like the experiences of like the worst kind of abuses of labor that led to the labor movement. This is why we have child labor laws and weekends and, and overtime and all of these different notions. And like that she really walked the walk and came from those kind of humble beginnings. And, like so often you see this story of like somebody who showed tremendous promise, was able to pick themselves up by their bootstraps and get recognized for being exceptional. And then she goes on to have this role where she's able to then kind of become raised in the ranks and then become somebody who is then abusing others the way we saw her do it on the severed floor. But I think it's fascinating that she brings that experience of doing truly heinous work to having created the severance chip in the first place.
Yeah. This is from Miranda. Miranda R, who writes in and says, I've seen so much hate for this episode that this is a delayed or poorly timed explanation of Cobel's motivations, but I really enjoyed it. It's an odd place to put it in the season, but it makes me very curious what will happen next week, because I suspect they're telling us this exactly when we need to know it. All of that to be said, I've been reflecting a lot on what we now know was a traumatic childhood for Cobel. Placing her in charge of the severance floor, stuck in middle management overseeing her creation, was obviously a special kind of hell, even if she did love it and want that proximity. But it seems so cruel to me to put someone who experienced child labor in charge of these naive, spirited, quote-unquote, young innies. Was the line, "We serve Kier, you child," something that was screamed at her as a kid? Was she punished with something like the break room? Was she forced to request handshakes or hugs or any affection at all? How much of her career is just continuing the cycle of abuse? I feel so strongly for Harmony Cobel. I can't wait to see what she'll do for a reintegrated Mark. I want her to get justice. So that is the take from Miranda. The other thing that made me think about was, remember when James goes to Helly thinking she's Helena and says, back then the chip was blue and green. The severance floor, lots of blues, lots of green. How much of that is a tribute to Harmony, right? Like how much of the severed floor is created as like, look at this amazing thing you've done, and we'll make all of the aesthetics look exactly the way that you would like.
Well, they do look great. Those colors look great on her.
They
so
do, of course.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting because I do think that this sits a lot better with me, this idea that it's not that Harmony is like secretly a good guy and has been trying to keep tabs on Mark so that she can, undo Severance and Lumon and all this stuff, but that she is caught in this cycle, right? That she is perpetuating the abuse that was given to her. I think that makes so much sense. And I think that it, gives us sympathy and empathy for her without like absolving her of the things that she's done. And so I think that that's a really interesting framing of it. And I think that really tracks with like how I'm feeling about all of this as it unfolds. As I too want her to get justice, but I also want her to receive justice, or like to others to receive justice for what she has done as well. And so I think that'll be really interesting.
She's a super damaged person. You must be cut to heal is something that Milchick says. We also see that in Sissy's shrine. You must be cut to heal. So this is like obviously part of the Kier ethos that Harmony grew up with. I think the questions of abuse outside of just the child labor are really interesting. I did see one interesting piece of speculation on Reddit that, if you'll allow me,
Of course.
I would like to share. And this gets a little bit at, kind of as a young Harmony Cobel, like how did she exactly get into this to begin with? Obviously, Sissy is a believer in the teachings of Kier. We know that Charlotte, Harmony's mother, was not. She hated Lumon and she hated Kier more than anybody. But Charlotte gets sick and needs to be cared for. Redditor Cressida speculates that Cobel's Aunt Sissy might have been the first person to ever be severed by Harmony as a test case in order to take care of Charlotte when Charlotte was dying. That the pain of caring for this terminally ill relative and the sound of the hacking and the coughing, the fact that Sissy doesn't remember uh Charlotte's last words, there that Harmony might have felt guilty for leaving. Like, did she develop something? Was she experimenting with something that she might have used? Is this why Sissy doesn't go upstairs, I think, at all during the episode? Like, why the room is locked? Nobody's gone in that room. Maybe she has gone in that room, but she just doesn't remember it. I feel like this is a reach, but there were enough kind of odd, deliberate choices in the episode about where the characters were placed in relation to each other that it does make me consider there's a possibility that Sissy might have been severed and that this might have been one of but again, like, then she would have known, like, she
Right.
probably would have known about, like, the reveal. So maybe this doesn't track so well, but
With no evidence to back it up at all, the one that feels right to me is that Harmony would have severed her mother, like, to spare her from the illness.
Mhm.
But I'm just thinking that right now, and I've done, like, no work to connect that to the show.
Yeah.
Particularly if Harmony was also a believer in this idea of, like, yeah, so, like, the version of her mother that she knows is no longer the one that's suffering, and so it's this, like, other version, and, the next thing that version knows is it's, this soul that will go to
Sits
heaven,
with
right?
sits with Kier, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's definitely there's definitely possibilities here that, like,
Which would
this
be
is
super freaking twisted if then, like, from everything we've experienced and known from the show, that these innies are, like, full-fledged independent people with
Mhm,
attributes in common and a body in common, but have their own experiences and have, like, lived their own
Mhm.
lives in whatever form they've been allowed to. Um, Harmony's mother's innie, the only experience she would have had is dying.
mhm,
And so if Harmony, like, has kind of figured that out, that's what this is, that's what that was. That's what that was. Like,
Mhm.
that would add a real layer of grief and certainly agita, not to put too fine a point on it,
Mhm.
as to why maybe she would be looking for some form of retribution or redemption or absolution here, something like that.
mhm. Yeah, maybe.
Dark, dark. Dark stuff. Neil writes in. Neil in favor of this episode. Neil says, I wanted to draw attention to what I thought were some skillful and literary writing in this episode.
Mm.
In the recap, you referred to a garage or subterranean layer. Sorry to be pedantic, but this is a root cellar, which are common in
Yeah.
Newfoundland, where this was filmed. Neil says, I'm Canadian, just like Melissa, and just happened to visit Fogo Island a few
What?
years ago. That this particular root cellar is full of Harmony's childhood Lumon roots is just a chef's kiss of a
Oh,
metaphor for the
yeah.
psychological journey of the episode. Neil also adds, Harmony embodies her dying mother in her deathbed, atonement with the
Mhm.
father in Joseph Conrad terms. There are two references to rebirth. First, when she huffs and says, I haven't done that since I was 8, taking her back to a time in her life before she became a Lumon soldier. Second, when she emerges from the root cellar, armed and tangibly committed to being anti-Lumon like her mother. I found the mirroring of Mark's ego death and the Bardo to be satisfying and maybe
Mm.
a reason for this dedicated episode.
Interesting.
So some fascinating call
Yeah.
outs.
And Neil knew it was Newfoundland. So
Yes.
like that made
Neil knows Severance.
Neil knows. Neil knows Newfoundland.
Yeah.
It's so funny. I was looking back over my notes for this episode. The first two things I wrote is like, oh, ocean, more water stuff going on. And then the second thing I wrote is very curious where these exteriors were filmed, which is code for, is this Canada?
Is this Canada?
Anyway, I was very excited.
We've got this from Becky in Austin. Becky has some questions about episode 8. Harmony wants to be driven to Sissy's house in case, quote unquote, they're watching the house, which would entail surveillance. But isn't there like no electricity at the property? There's no electric poles or lines leading to the house. They use oil lamps, no phone lines. So I find it curious that Harmony asks whether anyone has called. I doubt there's a cell tower nearby either, and yet Harmony's phone is ringing. So what did we think of the technology in town? Was that anything that sent up any kinds of flags for either of you?
Yeah. Well, where Sissy lives, like it was definitely, I mean, this almost felt like, I don't know, Amish Mennonite adjacent. Like it didn't seem like she had a lot of modern technology, but I do think that it's likely that she had a phone, right? Because she does ask if there were calls. I don't know about the cell tower coverage, Melissa. Maybe you can speak better to cell coverage in the more remote locations of Canada. But I mean, I don't know if
I'm a part-time Mainer, which is closer to Newfoundland than Melissa is.
Yeah,
and let me tell you what, you get in the middle of the woods, that cell service sucks.
Yeah.
So bad.
Yeah, but
well.
you could still have
So
like
hard.
a phone line.
A landline.
Yeah. So I think that that's probably realistic to, it's interesting because I think there's probably like some but not great coverage in general in parts of that. So yeah, but maybe there is sort of this explaining of some of the, like a continuation of this where all the technology feels like just not quite modern day. And so maybe there's a bit more of that here, but yeah.
It is interesting though to think like maybe it's possible that Harmony asks Hampton for help, not because she really believes that there's going to be surveillance, but because she wants to see him, right? Like she actually like needs some moral support and some connection to somebody who she knows cares about her on some level. It feels like, I think, a little bit more satisfying to me that coming to this town and like not just like seeing the depression of it and not just going to have this confrontation with her aunt, that after driving all of this way and after like in order to fortify her for whatever she's going to do next, she might have needed to connect to somebody who she knew would push her moral compass in the right direction. So I like the idea that even if it is we have to be a little bit incredulous about how sophisticated the surveillance technology is out in the sticks, like in the most remote part of Salt Neck. Like maybe Harmony is just using this line so that she can get a ride with her buddy and sneak a little smooch, which was an unscripted smooch.
Yeah.
Unscripted smooch. Spontaneous, improvised smooch.
Wow.
Yeah. And one of the things that I thought was interesting. So when she's talking and having this conversation about Sissy who lives out by the 9, my first thought, so I looked up, US Route 9 is the north-south highway that goes through Delaware,
I know Route
New Jersey,
9.
And New York.
I know Route.
Yeah.
I know Route 9 pretty well.
Yeah. I figured the two of you would. So that was my first thought, but also like I don't think she's living near a highway. I think this is far more remote than that.
I think it's she's living by the 9, meaning she's like the 9 core lumen
according to the 9 principles. I think
that
certainly makes more sense.
I think it means like that she's kind of, it's like keeping kosher basically.
Yeah.
I think that that's what she's doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, why don't we talk about ether? Because we have not yet on the podcast today. And Melissa, I don't know if you have any major thoughts on this being an ether town. Certainly Alyssa does, writing in Dr. Alyssa, writing in about with a very, very long feedback email that I cannot possibly read in its entirety, but a lot of different points on ether and its connections to the show, beginning with that it was specifically linked to dental work in the 1840s. So hello, testing for dental work. Ether uses were also tested on animals and pets, perhaps even goats. That ether and frolic are even connected. Substances like ether and nitrous oxide were around far before they started being used in medical procedures. Ether was discovered in 1540. It was described as by Valerius Cordus as oleum vitrioli dolce, sweet vitriol. The concept of frolic is specifically related to ether as well. According to a 1942 presidential address at the Royal Society of Medicine, ether was used medicinally in the 18th century for respiratory pulmonary diseases, but it became increasingly used instead for entertainment and the quote-unquote production of the frolics. So ether being involved in the show maybe was a long time coming. Alyssa also adds that ether, like the severance procedure, has some contention over who was the real inventor. So perhaps diving deep into the topic of ether is ill-advised in many ways. But as far as reading about it and trying to connect it to some severance could be quite useful.
That's excellent, Dr. Alyssa. Thank you so much. Yeah, I had heard some of those details, and the frolic connection in particular, really interesting. And then we've made like some connections on the pod before about how like severance as some kind of neurosurgical anesthetic is similar to the use of ether and some of these other similar compounds. I do want to like, can we use this as an opportunity to stomp down on frolic for a moment?
Yeah, of
Yeah.
course.
I've always found it pretty intriguing that the tempers are woe, malice, dread, and frolic.
Yes.
3 very bad things, like just not good things. Like I don't like to experience woe, malice, and dread. Obviously, woe is sadness, malice is anger, dread is fear. So these are kind of more of the typical labels for emotions. And interestingly, if you study emotions and emotional processing, they tend to break them down into sadness, fear, uh, fright, or I'm sorry, so sadness, fear, anger, and then happiness is like a much more diffuse and elusive emotion. Actually, it's like less very clearly tied to a signature in our limbic systems. Like contentedness is in some ways like the absence of those woe, malice, and dread like feelings. So on the one hand, it's not terribly odd that we have 3 very negative emotions and 1 positive emotion, but I've always thought that like frolic is a particularly interesting choice, and maybe this isn't referring to happiness as much as it's referring to a type of mania, which would be this euphoria that is out of control, this desire or something that has a positive valence but is ultimately quite dangerous. Like I don't think that this is frolic in a neutral sense. I think that this is kind of a dangerous type of frolic, and it's interesting to tie that notion to ether because you know if you talk about what has a powerful signature in our limbic system and is emotionally laden, it's cravings and addictions, like the intense appetitive drive towards something. So I think that this isn't like happy feelings with butterflies. I think that this is more like an ether induced madness.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because yeah, like side effects of ether intoxication can involve things like euphoria, visual and auditory hallucinations, distorted thinking. It can be so it's really interesting. The thing that I thought about, I think that makes a lot of sense because the other thing, again, something that we tested for as a part of my graduate work was emotional recognition. It tends to be something that's impaired in people with schizophrenia. They have a hard time because they're often like misinterpreting like emotional cues from other people, right? It's a part of this kind of distorted experience of reality. And so they And so it was the test
Did you
was that
use the Ekman faces?
yeah. So
What is
it was
that?
basically so it's these basically it's this idea that sort of cross-culturally, we humans are very good at recognizing these emotions that Amanda's talking about, right? Fear, anger, disgust, sadness, and
Yeah.
happiness are like the 5 different faces. And so it's all of these different people expressing these 5 different faces. And so it would sort of be shown on a computer, and it's like, okay, what emotion is this being tested for? And or the other one was like, here's the list of emotions, which one is it? And so there's different ways that you can sort of get an assessment of how good someone is at kind of emotional recognition in other people. And this is something that we tend to see impaired in certain mental health
Mhm.
illnesses.
Yeah.
So yeah, my other experience with ether is the thing that I always think of, which is I don't know why this is like stuck in me so much, but the idea of it being used in dental surgery, the thing that I most know it from is from Cider House Rules,
Mm.
the
Yes,
book.
which
Um,
also is starring, the actress who plays Sissy.
Oh,
oh,
Jane
crazy.
Alexander.
Jane
Yeah.
Alexander is
Oh,
in Cider
yeah.
House Rules.
I'm just always like Michael Caine. So I like I think I was in high school when I both read the book and watched the movie. But so it was the doctor would use it basically to perform illegal abortions as an like an anesthetic, but also was an ether addict himself. And yeah, so I thought that that was really interesting. And then I was looking up the other literary references for ether addiction. The other big one that kind of stood out as important is Tolstoy's War and Peace. So we've got some
Oh,
Russian
Russian
literature coming in here
literature.
as well.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I thought that that was interesting. Also, Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, just for some
Oh,
bit of a
another
religious
great book. Mhm.
stuff in there, and then things like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas as well. But
Wow.
yeah,
I know ether best because in the Final Fantasy video games, you drink ethers and you restore your magic points.
yeah. So there's also Aether, which is like very similar but different, very importantly different.
And I just hoard them until the end of the game and I never use them ever.
Yes, I'm a
They're
classic
also
video
really
game hoarder as
expensive.
well. You have to open
They're-
every box, you have to collect everything, and then you have to
and never
hold on
use
to
it.
it and
Never
never
use
use
it.
it.
I'm
Yep,
going to need it for the final fight.
totally.
You never need it for the final fight. How about this from Reverend John? Reverend John writes in about the technology and how this episode maybe
Mhm.
advances some of the reasons why, like the computers, the cars, the phones seem like relics of the 80s and 90s, while Lumen has made advances far ahead of our current biotechnology. So Reverend John says, I think the creators of the show are working from a sort of zero-sum game, recognizing the limitation of human innovations. What if instead of advances in the microchip that lead to personal computers and cell phones, Lumen had steered the greatest minds to hacking the mind and the human soul? Computing, cars, other areas that took a leap with the microchip would be much slower to evolve. Lumen gobbled up the engineers that would have led to those advances and repurposed them to something much less useful to the vast majority of people. Since the latest episode seems like a nod to the industrial age of 100 years ago, I think that the show is speculating what would have happened if technology had taken a different
Mhm.
turn. The weird vocabulary seems to support a frozenness in time. The child labor practices from that era certainly point to a stuckness in a time and would be an excellent dystopian vision of tech firms abandoning a higher duty in favor of vanity projects to gain immortality. That's Reverend John's take on how this episode reflects some of the technology on Severance. I
That's
love that.
great stuff from Reverend John, but I do want to point out we have personal computers and cell phones in Severance.
Yes.
That Devin
We're like
definitely goes
flip
on like
phones. We're behind.
no, there's real there's a mix of things. People have
We do have
different
some
things,
touchscreens.
and Devin definitely had a laptop and looked up like Facebook and like art, like it was like the Severance version of Facebook. So they have this stuff. It does seem to be very interestingly distributed through society. So maybe there's a little bit of there's more of this gatekeeping for who has what technology, and there's like obviously vast discrepancies in what's available. But we have seen smartphones and we have seen laptop computers.
I missed them with my dumb eyes. I missed the
Mhm.
smartphones.
The other tiny thing, sorry, I was just reading more about ether. The last bit though that I thought was interesting. So it's an NMDA receptor antagonist. So this means that it blocks the receptors in the brain that bind to this molecule NMDA. And NMDA receptors are thought to be very important for controlling synaptic plasticity, so changes in your brain, like new connections being formed and that kind of thing, and mediating functions like learning and memory. So anyway, that seemed also very appropriate for the show.
So at the end of the day, it always goes back to, is this character this character's parent? And so we've had some
Or
feedback
a
along both
clone,
lines.
or at least a clone.
Yeah, are they clones, or at least is that person's parent? So Cinnamon writes in. Cinnamon says, very random thought I had after watching the episode. Could Harmony be Helena's mother? We know nothing about Helena's mother. Harmony is old enough to be her mom. If Harmony was indoctrinated enough to give up this incredible invention of severance for the good of Kier, keeping the family bloodline going wouldn't be that much more of a leap. We continue to have this running pregnancy and baby storyline. Lumon has no problem abandoning people when they're no longer of use, so I could completely see Harmony having a baby because that was her duty. And we know that Harmony and Jaime interacted when she was younger. The timeline would work. Just saying.
Wow. I don't know about that. We'll put a pin in it, but I do want to bring that to another related issue, which is that Ms. Selvig was a pretty serviceable lactation consultant.
Yes.
So she seemed to know something enough to at least convince Devin of the part. And she did seem pretty comfortable around a baby. And, I just in the little snippets we got, like her stories checked out. So I think it's interesting to wonder about Harmony Cobel and whether she ever had children, how much she might have been around children.
Well, she was around a ton of children as a child. And
As a child.
I don't say
Yes.
that glibly, truly. I mean, we now
Mhm.
know a lot more about this town that she grew up in and child labor. And so how many kids was she caring for? Was she caring for babies? Was she,
Yeah.
was she, like something of a wet nurse as an 8-year-old? It's horrible to think
Oof.
about. But like, what does this look like for Harmony's involvement in this town? So I don't know. It doesn't not track for me.
Yeah. Gosh.
What do
Every
we-
now and then I think
Yeah.
we've gotten to the darkest part of Severance, and I'm like, it can't possibly be that dark, right? And then
Oh,
you know,
I think
once
we
you
haven't
know,
even been in the
darker.
Cold Harbor room yet, Melissa. I
know.
think it's going to get dark. Can I bring up a couple of other things that I think we need to be
Yes.
thinking about now that we know a little bit more about Harmony? Okay, Bert had a partner at Lumon that Fields refers to about this is the Attila comment. Oh, like when you mentioned that to your old partner, they had this reaction. If we imagine there was a time when Harmony was a little bit more higher brass at Lumon and she was creating the severance chip before they tried to relegate her to middle management, is there any chance that Harmony and Bert could have brushed shoulders or
Ooh.
maybe had a more involved relationship as business partners with each other?
That would make some sense to me, and also would connect Bert's O&D work as his innie with his outie. Science guy, like to put his like to do technology things. Technology.
Yeah, very possible.
I think that is on the table for me. And then if we're going to talk about Bert, let's talk about Irving too. Irving has been making lots of calls. We've thought maybe Ragabi, maybe somebody else. We did speculate, could this be Cobel? Could they be co-conspirators? Was there possibly a time where Cobel had a break with Jaime Egan? The board doesn't talk to her anymore. We've talked about the ways that she's disrespected and abused by the company. Was part of this break with the Egans and her role as a manager of the severed floor, did she want a guy on the inside? Like, has she and Irving potentially with that list? Where did he get that list? Somebody who probably knows a thing or two. Could Harmony have been involved with that? I think it's pretty on the table in the discussion now that the person that that Irving's been making calls to could very well be Cobel.
Yeah, I was thinking Ragabi for a long time, but I think that this episode really opens up the possibility that he's been collaborating with Harmony.
Yeah, for
Making
sure. I
lots
think
of
that
really
we're
long distance phone calls though, because she's so far away.
That's why she's not answering, because she's
I know.
been driving.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's illegal to answer the phone and drive in Canada.
That's
so,
true.
yeah.
That's true. Well, maybe
Yeah.
not in the world of Severance. We don't know.
Yeah.
It's a little bit different than our world, just a little bit.
Just a touch. One last piece of feedback. This is once again going back to Polysonic. I mentioned before that Polysonic had a couple of interesting pieces of feedback this week, and I really liked this. Polysonic writes in, it's remarkable how much we learned about Harmony's past and inner state without flashbacks. If you read episode 7, not as a flashback for the audience, but rather innie Mark learning about Gemma and outie Mark's relationship and grief for the first time, then I'm pretty sure this show has not used any flashbacks at all. I find it fascinating and impressive in the construction of a TV show like this that spans a few centuries. So would we have wanted any kind of young Harmony flashback here, Melissa? Like, would that have done anything one way or the other to this episode? Or are you like Polysonic and appreciative of the show's ability to convey much of Harmony's backstory without having to actually show us what it was like for her as a kid?
It's interesting, right? Because I think so often I'm a fan of shows being able to show and not tell, and this episode needed to have a little bit of them telling us what their lives were like, but we did get to sort of see it based on the vibe and the interactions and everything. So I don't know that it's necessarily a note of like praise either way, but I do think that it is interesting.
Praise
Yeah. It certainly could have been an active choice, whether it was or wasn't, but I think that it's in thinking about it, it would have been interesting. I think it would have given us more information, but it might have been a situation where we're flashing back and forth and we are spending less time in the like here and now of Cobel's current situation, the current situation of this town, and the fact that sure, maybe at a time this town was doing better, the people in it were certainly not, but maybe the like sort of tone of this episode would have been quite different.
Yeah.
I want to say, first of all, I love the explicitly calling out that Jakai Bardo was not a flashback. That was Mark's mind palace. That's totally what I believe as well. And I do want to say, for somebody who's been a little bit down on this episode, there are things that this episode did incredibly well, like stunningly well. And I think communicating a lot of information in a very economical way and making that believable, making, Harmony's history with Hampton believable. Like, James LaGrosse comes in and totally sells that. I love that was an improvised smooch. I mean, that's just like fantastic.
Yeah, he gave a great Vulture interview where like he was like really thinking about this character a lot. And I guess like he and Patricia Arquette have been friends for a very long time.
They have a history. Yeah, she baked him cookies.
Yes.
And she put salted walnuts in those cookies. And she thought they were gross, but he thought they were delicious. So
better or worse than the cookies that Cobel makes for Mark?
So much better.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly so much better. So I think that this show has been like very, very economical in its storytelling. While I said that this episode could have been an email, the parts of it that couldn't have been an email is showing what a town that has been devastated by Lumon, showing how vast Lumon's reach is, how long the history is, how many people have had lives affected by it. We've noted that Lumon is a little bit controversial in the outside world. Here's yet another way in which they are controversial. So I think this episode did a lot in terms of building Harmony Cobel's character in a way that kind of changed everything we think about her, but is still super believable and consistent with everything that we've known about her.
Yep. If episode 9 takes us to Mr. Drummond's hometown and we spend the whole episode there.
Get the backstory of when he got that frolic tattoo. We meet the tattoo artist.
Yeah. Do we like that or we don't like that?
No, but I also don't think it's what we're getting. I think that
Yeah.
I think back to the last 2 episodes of season 1, and I
People
think we
will
are
be
in
in
for
the
a very
street.
wild ride. Like, I think it's gonna be great. I'm very, very excited. I think it's
Yeah.
gonna be
Mhm.
awesome.
Everybody who I've talked to in my real life who watches the show and loves the show keeps saying, how are they going to wrap this up? They've got so
Yeah.
much to do. And it's like, look, great question. Let's give them 2 more episodes
Mhm.
to figure it out. Hopefully they do. And it's Severance. It's foolish to bet against them. So
Mhm.
very excited for these final 2 episodes. Do we know what this next one is
We
called?
do know what the next one is called, Josh. It is called The After Hours.
The After Hours. Okay.
Mhm.
That's like a nightclub?
I'm not sure. It's written by Dan Erickson. It's directed by Uda Bracewitz, who has directed a handful of other episodes,
Yep.
including one this season. So I'm very excited. I really feel like, a little bit of what I was missing in episode 8 is Dan Erickson's voice. So I'm excited to hear that again. And yeah, like Melissa said, I have faith. If they would not withhold Dylan from us 2 episodes in the Zach Cherry 2
3
episodes in a
episodes in
row,
a row
3
because they did
episodes
do
in a
it
row.
too.
Yeah. People would riot.
Yeah. Yeah, I would be one
Look,
of
I've gotten thousands of people out in the streets, and I'll do it again. If I
Will
have to do I will.
with the pure influence of this very
Mhm.
podcast. Very, very exciting. That's going to do it until the after hours. The recap will be coming your way. Once that episode drops, we will be back with our deep dive into the episode, followed by theories and feedback. As always, make sure you are writing in Severance, RHAP at gmail.com. That's Severance, RHAP at gmail.com, and make sure you are subscribed. We Know Severance.com. That's the way to do it. If you want to subscribe to everything else going on at We Know Scripted TV, go to WeKnowScriptedTV.com for White Lotus, Daredevil, so much more happening here on the pod. You can talk to me on the internet at Round Howard. Dr. Amanda, where can people talk to you? What do you got going on?
You can find me on Blue Sky at Dr. Amanda R. And you can follow my other podcast, Crying Laughing Podcast, where we are also talking about the White Lotus and having a lot of fun with season 3.
Yes, Dr. Melissa, where can people find you?
Melissa Woodward 28, Whirlwind Pods, all the usual stuff. Lots of the usual. Veronica Mars. We're gonna be watching Brick this week. It's a war movie. We talked about that already. Doctor Who, Gravity Falls, Smash, One Indescribable Podcast previously on. All the good stuff.
Smash those subscribe buttons to all of those podcasts. So you're already in your podcast app right now. Go hit subscribe on a bunch of these things, please. Folks, we'll be back, hopefully with the gang, with the MDR4 in this next episode of Severance, The After Hours. Till then, everybody take care. Bye-bye.